Hi, everyone. Welcome to Craft Politics. I'm Joseph Lavoie.
I'm Andrew Percy.
And this week we are excited to have Chris Spoke on the show. He is here to talk about, because we are interested in talking about the housing crisis. And Chris is an interesting guest because he's not just a thinker on the topic, although he is obviously a big thinker on the topic, but he's also building through it. He's also the host of the Hogtown podcast. He's a developer focused on mid-rise rental housing and has been one of the loudest voices arguing that zoning, not greed, not foreign buyers, is the real villain of Canada's housing story. Of course, while we have been so consumed politically with tariffs, the trade war, and a whole bunch of other things, we can't forget that one of the big issues that's been dominating headlines in Canada from a political perspective for the last several years has been housing. And we're in a moment where politicians of every stripe say they want to fix the crisis, but it feels like almost nothing ever changes. So today, we're going to be exploring with Chris why is it so hard to build in cities, particularly where we need housing the most? Can federal interventions fix what local politicians are blocking? And what future are we choosing by what we allow, what we prevent? And so, Chris, welcome to Craft Politics.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let's get into it. What's the one thing most Canadians still don't get about what's causing the housing crisis in this country?
Yeah, I think like the big thing is the relationship between supply and prices. I think this is much better understood today than it was like 5 years ago when I first started really talking about this. Although like actually it was more like 7 years ago, where like even just the idea that if we build more housing, that should all else equal place downward pressure on prices and make housing more available and affordable. That was like a very controversial thing to say and to think. I think that has become somewhat consensus across party lines, maybe, to a lesser degree on the NDP, but between conservatives and liberals in Canada, certainly everybody talks as if they understand that we just need to build much more housing. So I say that as like the positive angle on this. The negative angle, of course, is that everybody agrees with that just so long as the new housing is not in their backyard. But if everybody thinks that, then, you run into the same problem.
Right. Yeah. Happy to have more housing. Don't put it in my backyard because I don't want my backyard to have a little bit more shade in it. And I don't want to have suddenly 15 neighbors to deal with next door. But you have touched on something, which is that it does seem like there's cross-party consensus that this is something we have to deal with. And there seems to be cross-party consensus, like federally, provincially. It seems like many of our municipal leaders appear to be on the same page on this. I just don't get the sense that there's a lot of change happening on the ground. Is that just a false perception I have? I know you're much closer to the action than I am, particularly in Toronto, but I want your perspective on why you think at least it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of activity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, again, like rhetorically, it seems to be that there is now a cross-party consensus on the idea that housing is expensive because fundamentally there's not enough of it. We just need to build more of it. And I think this is, again, like the Econ 101 explanation, which took a little bit of time to become accepted, but is now accepted. The problem is that it's one thing to accept that. It's another to enact the political changes, the policy changes, the legislative changes that rectify it. The reason why we are where we are is because you do have, I made the joke that everybody wants and agrees that we need more housing as long as it's not in their backyard. Like that is fundamentally true. There's this status quo bias that is deeply ingrained. There's this preference against new shadows, against new people competing for on-street parking, against new traffic, against new renters. And that largely drives the municipal, the most local politics that impact, like in Toronto, certainly where I operate, the big policy documents that regulate land use and where and how you could build. Higher levels of governments have different levers they can pull, but they ultimately run into this local problem where it is ultimately local regulation. And, one way to put it is that local municipal councillors are elected by long-term homeowning constituents to a much greater degree than new entrants, renters, young people who would like to enter their wards. So the political incentives are such that, people who don't want housing in their backyard are overrepresented. People who do want new housing options are underrepresented. And the equilibrium is that we still don't build enough housing.
Yeah, I think I used to find that I was in municipal politics before I was an MP, and it was, I used to say at that time, there's no votes in housing because it's, it's the people who are against planning development are always much more angrier and likely to remember than people who are in favor. So, and it's that interesting dilemma, isn't it? The dichotomy of like, everyone criticizes councillors for blocking housing, but they're also doing the job they're elected to do, which is to represent their current constituents. And, I used to knock on doors in relatively new housing estates where people would say, oh, I don't want that development over there because I like that field. And I'd say to residents, but what was here before your house was built?
Sure.
And they'd be like, oh, but that's okay though, because this was, and then what I realized is people come up with this really clever way of saying, oh yeah, but that was okay because that was organic growth. That was
Yeah,
like,
of
you know,
course.
that was kind of the point where my house was the last of the ones that should be allowed. So, but then the problem is if you try and get around that block, you're into the position of, you know, undermining local democracy, right? Because if
That's
you
right.
say, well, we're going to take these powers away and we're going to determine these things at a provincial or in the UK's case, a national level with bigger developments, then there's an undermining of local democracy. So I don't, you know, it's how you square that circle this is why, you know, for all the many reasons there may be, one of the biggest blocks to housing are politicians, right? Let's be honest about it. Because it's politician, and that's a block I don't ever see being removed because at the end of the day, politicians are going to respond to what their constituents want.
I think that's right. I think the choice is exactly that. You could have more local democracy and less housing, or you could have less local democracy and more housing. You know, you might be like not too surprised to hear that I would rather there be less local democracy and more housing. And there are a few ways that you could get to this, and you see this in various jurisdictions around the world. So even in Ontario, we do have the Ontario Land Tribunal, where municipal decisions can be appealed to a judicial, non-elected judicial body. And I think that is, you know, to some extent, a weakening or an undermining of local democracy, but it is ultimately led to, I think, better planning and more housing than there might otherwise be. You have other parts of the world. So California is now enacting state level land use liberalization measures because they know that the municipalities on their own won't. And maybe the most kind of extreme version of this is some point in the late 80s, I believe it was, Japan completely nationalized land use planning to get away from the local politics and the local capture of land use planning. And it's just led to a much more flexible land use environment and much more housing than there might otherwise be. So I think that's right. And I guess it just comes down to like, how much do you, I don't know, fetishize is the right word, or like uphold local democracy as the utmost, you know, absolute value, as opposed to, you know, more housing or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean the interest because that the you know the land tribunal is very similar to the planning system in the UK where local authorities can be appealed to the you lose your planning appeal lose your planning application, you appeal to the planning inspectorate who is independent, or the Secretary of State technically makes the decision but it's an independent inspector. But in some respects that possibly arguably makes it more like the local authority will reject it because they know that I mean, other than they end up getting costs awarded against them, which can be fairly substantial. But in some respects, it's like, okay, well, actually, we can say no at a local level because the planning inspector will approve it anyway, and we'll get the housing that the community probably needs. And you know, so it's a great idea, but in many ways, and all of that, of course, even if you get to the housing in the end, it's a massive drag on
It is.
on the on the timescales for delivering housing and the cost of actually delivering that whole project. So it's a really imperfect solution, but I don't know whether what's the alternative to, well, that problem's always going to exist. It's how we allocate land for development and how you build communities into that from the beginning so that it's very much their plan, right? In the UK, it's called a local plan, which has to go out to this massive consultation. Here's a little shocker of a fact. Not a lot of people engage in the consultation on the development of the local authority's 5-year land supply. It's not
Right.
the sexiest subject.
Sure.
But I just think, is there anything you've seen anywhere where there has been a model which is different, where you can bring the public along so they feel it's their development and their plan and they're in control of it? Because that's often the thing, is they're not against the 100 or the 200 extra houses. They're against what will come after that and after that. And I think it'll just be a, slicing.
Yeah, I've seen a few things. I think, I mean, one point that you mentioned that I think is worth reiterating is that, even the term local democracy overstates it to some extent, because it really is a small subset of like residents who participate in these processes. So they use the term local democracy, but it's like nowhere near a majority of people who have input into these plans and into these proposals. One idea that I saw actually coming out of some British think tanks is this idea of actually going even more local, where on a street by street basis, if a majority of residents on a given street vote to upzone, you upzone. And what that does is it helps them capture the land value increase of upzoning. I haven't seen this kind of tested out. There's like some slightly different version of it that's been experimented with in Israel, actually. But it's like you could either go upstream, go to a higher level of government, have something like a Canadian province, just set more boundaries on how restrictive municipalities could do. New Zealand has done a version of this, and I think it's been quite successful. And then, of course, Japan did it at the national level. But yeah, the alternative is you go even more local than on a citywide scale. You go to a street-by-street scale, and you almost have this kind of financial incentive for people to vote themselves an upzoning, let their lots be assembled by a high-rise developer, and they get the value and they get to move on. And it does require that buy-in, but the incentive is, I think, much stronger at that point.
Yeah,
That's a really fascinating concept to me, because I was going to ask originally, this seems to be like a national problem, certainly national enough that it's what Pierre Poilievre campaigned on for so long. The federal government's now coming out with a plan to build, I don't know, something like 500,000 units. We'll probably get to it shortly, whether the government's appropriately positioned to be building all these units. But it seems like it's a national problem, to which my question was going to be, do we need to find a way to change jurisdictional oversight on some of these things, so you just take the cities out of it? Technically, the way our constitution's written in Canada, the cities exist at the whim of the province. So provinces could flex a lot more muscle if they wanted. And presumably if there was type of a more integrated partnership with the federal government on this, you could say, like, screw like the small local NIMBY. So for our listeners that don't know, that acronym NIMBY means not in my backyard. Like, screw the small vocal NIMBY groups. The majority of people want more access to more affordable housing, and we're just going to rezone. But this is such a different concept, Chris. I prefer your approach, because I actually prefer politics being hyper localized.
Yeah. Just to add in to that as well, but your MLA still needs to get elected as well. So you shift the problem from one level of government to the next level of elected official. I mean,
well, you could have in theory, and actually Ontario's well set up for this, where, as Joseph mentioned, the province has the constitutional authority to basically do whatever it wants. So it could upzone cities. And this government specifically, the Conservative government, doesn't derive many of its votes from the urban centers. So it could, just upzone those ridings that it doesn't win any elections in. Right. And I think that would actually, I think that would be quite good, because it'd be upzoning Ottawa, Hamilton, and Toronto, the places in the province where we need the most housing. I think the problem provincially, frankly, has been a lack of courage or will or something like that. Like, they have the levers. I think the incentives are fine if they just kind of like target these upzonings to places where they're not competitive anyway. It's actually a bit of a question mark in my mind as to why they haven't done that, or they don't seem to want to do that.
Yeah, no, because certainly that government's had no problems telling Toronto to remove bike lanes.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is
also upzone. Far
more trivial of an issue.
Yeah.
What do you think a properly designed federal incentive would look like in your view? Like, are we focused on the right outputs? Does number of starts, is that the right metric that we need to be tracking success on? Like, how do we design this?
Yeah, I think you could go one of two ways, broadly speaking. And this was kind of like Trudeau versus Poilievre, a framework. And I'll explain a little bit of my thinking, but I actually think Trudeau had a better idea here than Poilievre did, despite being, much more of a Poilievre fan. So the two frameworks are on one hand, you had the Trudeau government through this vehicle, the Housing Accelerator Fund, paid cities for very specific upzoning measures. So it'd be something like, you need to permit 3-story, 4-unit multiplexes citywide, and if you do that, we give you some money. You need to eliminate minimum parking requirements. If you do that, we give you some money. On the other hand, the Poilievre government was much more of if you increase your completions by 15%, we'll give you money, or we won't withhold money, some version of a carrot or stick. But it was much more targeting this kind of outcome. And in my mind, it was much more centrally planned, to the extent that, there's no way that the federal government has a great idea whether Toronto needs 15 or 13 or 17% more completions next year versus this year. It seemed like overly top down. Whereas what the Trudeau plan and the Housing Accelerator plan was just targeting very specific obstacles, regulatory obstacles, and paying cities to remove them. And I think that's where you need to go. I think the idea that the federal government has the data or even the capacity to properly assess how many starts and how many completions we need feels, borderline socialist, in terms of the central planning. What we need to do is identify regulatory obstacles and remove them, and let the market determine what volume of supply we need to respond to rising prices. The problem on the Trudeau side, with most problems on the Trudeau side, has been the execution. So, the federal government entered into this Housing Accelerator Fund agreement with the City of Toronto, $471 million that it would pay the city for various deregulatory measures. First of all, it was negotiated to be extremely unambitious and tame. It would not solve the problem. It would not be good value for dollar. And then even on those unambitious targets, the city has not come close to achieving any of them, and there's no real consequence as far as the agreement goes. So I think the idea is good, pay for deregulation, but I think you really need the right team, the right minister, the right political staff to do it properly.
The bigger problem, though, in public buying is it's interesting there because, you know, I was intrigued by the idea that reducing minimum parking is a way to incentivize housing, whereas actually one of the biggest complaints I used to get from my constituents about housing was, oh, it's not being built with enough parking, and if it had the parking, I might not be against it. It's almost like, you know, it's kind of like more regulatory obstacles or requirements to make it acceptable, because it would be, oh, I'm not against new housing, but what about the capacity in the local GP service? What about the school capacity? What about the drain capacity, the sewer capacity? Parking was always a massive one. This thing of they don't build them with enough parking now, and that's just going to you know, destroy my community even more. So when we were talking earlier, I was thinking, oh, actually, is this one of the solutions? Is actually for government to say, actually, you have to come and do this, but you must do this, 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 and this to get more of that community buy-in. All of which, of course, adds up on the cost of what the development then ends up being, which pushes up prices for everybody, and we're all concerned about that as well. So I just don't know whether
I think. Well, just general on that point specifically, like the first thing that this kind of highlights is that there is no one thing. It's almost like we have to do 100 things to solve this problem. And I think that's like just the nature of complex economies and complex political problems. On the parking question specifically, you know, often we hear the same things. And the concern from the community is it's always a concern over what externalities will this project introduce. And one externality might be that you have more of these residents in a building that is undersupplied on parking will now be parking on their street, and they won't have the ability to park on their street. And I think you have like potential clever solutions, like in this new project, you could disclose, and this could be on title, that none of the residents in this building will have access to on-street parking permits. And that's just kind of like something they have to accept. And it's, you know, maybe not like the ideal solution, but it does kind of thread the needle a little bit, where the developer still has the ability to make a market-based decision on how much parking they think they need, and neighbors could be reassured that there won't be this externality of these people parking on their streets. And we've actually seen this in Toronto, where in agreements of purchase and sale in new condos, it's often listed, and it's required by the city to say, if you buy a unit in this condo, you will not have access to on-street parking. So either buy a parking spot in this building or you have no parking. And we're in this weird transition point in a lot of our cities, and this is certainly true in Toronto, where we hit our growth spurt later than cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, for example, that were built much more densely and for much more kind of walkable, transit-oriented lifestyles. So we have like somewhat sprawly cities, but we're moving to a point where maybe people are less reliant on cars. But this transition phase is very difficult because we don't yet have the transit that would be sufficient for a fully car-free lifestyle, but we no longer have the space to provide as much parking as we did 20 years ago in new developments. And it's a very weird transition phase. And I don't have like the perfect solution, but I think you could find these compromises on a case-by-case basis.
What you guys have both talked about, to me, is like, so you have voters or residents or local citizens. The pushback is they assume a negative evolution to their neighborhood. Oh, if you add this development, I'm going to have less parking. There's going to be more people on the streets. There's going to be traffic jams. And to me, that is a function of potentially how effective the YIMBY campaigns are, you know, very small groups that are extremely vocalized. Chris, do you have a sense of why it seems like we can't get in this country the YIMBY, the yes in my backyard movements to be much more effective? Is it just because it's easier to be opposed to something? Is it because we, you know, organizing people around market-based principles is just not particularly attractive in an urban core? Why are we not getting traction with these YIMBY movements?
I think there's this idea of like diffuse benefits and concentrated harms. So, you know, to bring an analogy from a completely different sector, if, for example, America subsidizes its sugar producers to a very large extent, or it's diffuse harm, concentrated benefit. So everybody pays a little bit more for sugar, but maybe not enough to like organize a rally around it. Whereas if you wanted to kill that sugar subsidy, there are a small group of people who are hyper motivated to like maintain it. And I think there's something like that on the NIMBY YIMBY dichotomy, where at a citywide or even province-wide policy, like big picture policy level, you are seeing more YIMBY advocacy and involvement. But on a project by project basis, the harms of one given project in terms of new shadows, new parking, new traffic are much more concentrated and will motivate those neighbors to a much greater extent than a YIMBY who just wants like 20% more housing in the city. It's not so much about this one project. It's a more abstract idea. And I think that's part of it.
We've actually gone beyond YIMBYs. I mean, do you have the phrase here, bananas? Yeah,
Yes.
which is the build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything brigade.
Yes,
But a lot of
yes,
it
yes.
is like,
I haven't heard that one
banana.
yet.
So this is the thing, like we'd find on a lot of the developments in my local area, it was actually not even people. I kind of like, I used to object to the phrase NIMBY to use it because obviously I was an elected official. So I used to generally be aligned
Sure.
with the people who were against it. And I say, no, you're not a NIMBY if you have a right to say what you would like to, how you'd like to see your community and the one you live in. But you'd have this bananas brigade who were the people who had no connection to the area, who, if there was a tree, if it include the removal of trees or it was on green field, you'd have we're losing all this agricultural, food production land, and that's really dangerous because we're more reliant on imports, and and you just have this, everything was very much about no development, particularly, and then of course the easy solution, which and a lot of politicians fall into, is go, oh well, of course I'm in favour of brownfield development. Well, we all know what that really means because, well, there aren't that many brownfield sites, and a lot of the ones that do exist are incredibly hard to actually, undertake the necessary works to make them developable. But I just think it's, we're beyond the NIMBYs. And in the UK, in the new Labour government, I don't know whether you followed on planning, was very much, the last Conservative government was terrible. We were awful on new housing starts, all the rest of it. They were going to be a YIMBY government. And it's been very funny watching how their MPs, who were elected on this YIMBY thing, are suddenly finding unique and specific reasons for why that one particular development in their constituency just doesn't quite fit with that pro-development thing. And it's always that, yes, I'm in favor of this. However, there are unique and specific reasons why it shouldn't quite happen near me. And I just, it's that broader movement of just people who've been anti-development, who have no interest in the area, now getting themselves involved, which just clogs everything up and makes everything so much noisier.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we see this certainly in the Anglosphere. Like, even if you look at this problem of NIMBYism and restrictive land use policies and expensive housing, it is much more pronounced actually in Anglosphere countries. And maybe this is like a function of common law or something like that, or local democratic participation.
But when did it happen? This is what I'm intrigued about. So my village in England I live in is this tiny little village of 700 people. And in the 60s, they built Europe's biggest coal-fired power station, one side of it. And then in the 70s, a massive motorway, 6-lane motorway, the other side of it. And I'm thinking, how did any of these things get approval? Because, today, all of which was built on, green fields, on productive farmland. And what was the I don't know. I have no idea. But when did Anglosphere countries, because this is a common phenomenon, as you've rightly identified, when did we go from being pro-development to being just anti-development for anything? You can't build a factory, you can't do anything on, because everyone's just against everything. What was the tipping point?
There's this website that is WTF happened in 1971, and there are all these charts that show like productivity was rising until 1971, and then it flatlined, fertility rates, energy production, all these things, and nobody knows WTF happened in 1971, but it does seem to be around that time, coincidentally or maybe not, when like boomers hit voting age. And I think there was this confluence of factors where you had, on one hand, a rise in the environmental movement, the idea that nothing humans do should have any adverse impact on the ecology or our environment, and that's led a lot of new regulation as far as building new roads, new factories, new housing. You've also had this generally kind of like anti-business sentiment, the Ralph Nader kind of like fight against big business sort of thing that happened around the same time. And then I think fundamentally it's just, the further and further you go as a country away from the last big war, all these rules and regulations, they just kind of like they just layer one on top of the other. And any one of them on their own is probably fine and defensible and has some rationale. But when you take let's even go from 1971, 55 years of just layers and layers of tweaks and rules and added complexity, at some point it's like adding pebbles to a river and the river just stops flowing. And I think that's where we've gotten. And this whole idea of Doge, just to jump around here a little bit, was like you need some sort of forcing function to just clear the way, and that wasn't successful. And maybe there is nothing short of a war that is like sufficiently salient to the population to be able to like reset on these things. But timeline wise, it does seem to me that the late 60s, early 70s is when this started ramping up.
So
But I found it was rather nostalgic. I found Mark Carney's announcement during the campaign on let's get government into building homes again was a nostalgic throwback, right? He talked about post-World War construction. We built all these homes for all these soldiers coming back from the war. And I did have myself that moment. I was like, I mean, I'm fundamentally opposed to the idea that government can build 500,000 homes a year or whatever metric we attach to it. But I was like, yeah, but there was a time where I know the government was able to get things done at an expedited rate. Chris, do you have a perspective on that policy concept? Is this something that is at all feasible for this government to pull off?
I do have it. I think they're like using an incorrect analogy, which is that after the World Wars, World War II specifically, there was a ton of greenfield development, basically the creation of whole new cities. Ajax was basically created by, that era's version of CMHC, where it's much easier to take a big farm, subdivide the lots, take the same design from a catalog and build 500 units. They're trying to apply that same idea to 2025 when we have in the GTA a green belt and all development is necessarily infill with unique lot conditions with existing neighbors. By the way, the post-World War development that the government led was not in any neighborhood where there were existing neighbors. It was all greenfield, so you didn't have this political problem. So I think it's wrong to draw the analogy. And then further to that, the idea that what's missing today, if you think about why don't we have enough housing? If to build housing, you need developers, you need capital, you need materials, you need labor, you need land, you need entitled land. I don't think anybody who's like really researched this closely would say that it's that we don't have enough developers, and therefore the government needs to plug that market failure by creating a new developer. Like every other factor of production could probably be tweaked, but this just seems like a solution in search of a problem. And what I see, frankly, is I use this term which I copied from Ezra Klein, everything bagel liberalism, which is the idea that like you have to address all 10 of your coalition constituencies so that you could get to any solution. So, some amount of your base just wants more housing supply and deregulation, so you'll do some of that. Some amount of your constituency wants more energy efficient buildings, so you do some of that. More affordable buildings, you do some of that. And some want more government-led projects, so you'll do that too. Not because it actually solves a problem, but you're just trying to speak to like a subcategory of your base.
Yeah. Chris, what got you into this line of work in the first place?
I, unlike most developers, got into development through advocacy. A lot of developers find themselves becoming advocates just because it's so frustrating. But no, I was working in software development. I was trying to understand why prices for housing were rising in Toronto, trying to understand how housing is approved and regulated, looking to these kind of nascent YIMBY groups in Northern California primarily. And that just sent me down this rabbit hole of realizing how regulated to death the built environment is, and then after doing that for a few years, I thought maybe instead of talking about it, I'll actually get involved and build some stuff. So that's where we are now.
Nice. And I assume by now you'd hope to have built 100 projects, and you got maybe 2 on the go.
That's right. Yeah. We move as quickly as the city determines is acceptable for us to move, which is much more slowly than I would like. Yes.
I wish you, I hope you're very successful in getting the other 100, just not if I ever return to elected politics in my area, in which case I will condemn you. I shall come after you. I shall be with the people. I'll be but if
you're part of the problem, Percy.
Of course, yes, I want to get elected. I mean, actually, I have to say,
when we read it,
there's a serious idea where in my local area, we tried an approach. I worked really close with my local council who have the planning powers, and we were quite successful in hitting the housing targets and a whole range of other things by actually working really early on with developers and with the community, so that we were able to bring the community along on, organic or slightly more than organic development. So if a developer was going to come in and say, I'm going to do 800 houses here, we'd say to them, you're never going to get the public on board here. You're not going to get us on board here. But what people will stand for is if you bring them along, take them along, and we have some organic growth, not, I just mean 3 or 4 houses, but you might get, a bigger development. There is a route, actually, for all the joking aside about being on the, with my placards against Chris. There is a route if you can take communities along, but it's a time-consuming process, and that,
full-time campaigning, isn't
and
it?
it's not gonna, and it is going to be in a much more piecemeal, bit by bit, which doesn't then hit these massive targets of, I think the UK Labour government said it's going to build 1 million homes or something. Well, you don't do that through a couple of hundred here and 100 there over a very long period. But there is a route where you can bring people along, because most people will understand there has to be some growth. If our I say to constituents, our citizenry is getting older, more single person households for longer, and a growing population. Like, we do need houses. So you can have that, but it's what people hate is the feeling of big development happening to them and they have no voice in it.
Yeah. It is interesting that there is, a large variance in attitudes across jurisdictions as well. So like Texas builds a lot of housing and has been pushing a lot of YIMBY inspired bills recently. And I think fundamentally, this is almost maybe the most difficult thing to change is it's people's attitudes towards change and growth.
Right.
And some people are naturally opposed and some people are naturally excited and supportive of it. And that I have very few answers on how to change that level of attitude. But to your point, Andrew, beneath the political layer are voters who like want certain things. And like, I don't know how you change their minds at scale, but again, in Texas, for example, they're much more open to these things than in California, and maybe in California even more than the UK.
Well,
so yeah,
maybe because California's against, that's why Texas is in favor, right? So
that's right.
But,
so maybe you need France to be very NIMBY.
That's right.
If
France was anti-development, Britain would be pro-development.
Right.
It's
so true. Chris, can we close this out? This is new. We haven't done this yet with the guests, so you'll be the guinea pig. We'll see how it works out. Rapid fire round. Are you good if I throw a bunch of things at you?
Yeah, totally.
All right. One housing policy you wish was law tomorrow.
No height limits.
Ooh, no height limits. All right. I like that. Okay. One persistent myth about housing that's driving you up the wall.
That rents are determined by landlord greed and not supply and demand.
Ooh, that's a good one. Very good one. Yeah, people assume.
Yeah, the growth of the nasty landlord. Like,
yeah.
That's right. Landlords are no less greedy in Hamilton than they are in Toronto, but our rents here are higher. So there's probably more to it.
Good point. One book or thinker who has most shaped your view on urban planning.
So the author's name is Alain Berthaud. He wrote a book called Order Without Design and basically applied more of an economic way of thinking to cities and how they used to grow pre-modern restrictive planning and how that was superior in many ways to very restrictive planning. So Order Without Design, great book.
Nice. Good. I'll add that to the reading pile. And then lastly, worst NIMBY moment you've witnessed. What happened?
Yeah, I'll think of the first one that comes to mind. There might be worse than this, but I remember one of the first public meetings I went to. This was before I was a developer. I was just an interested advocate, and everybody was very much against this rental building, and they were yelling at the developer. They were yelling at the councillor, and I stood up with a question. It was more a comment to the group, and I said, if we don't build this building, the people who would live in it don't stop existing. They have to go somewhere, and they're going to bid up other properties, and where are they supposed to go? And this is a very hyper-local reference, but someone yelled, they could go to Brampton, which is a way of saying, like, they could get out of my city.
Right.
And it just seemed like very, unwelcoming at minimum. And it was, and everyone like applauded it.
Yeah, there. For those who aren't familiar with Toronto geography, there might be some racial undertones as well to that. Like
there were definitely some of that.
Yeah.
So I just
that's
have
horrible.
2 takeaways from this is, one, it all went to cock in 1971, which I think is when Joseph was born. And secondly, more war equals more housing. Is that right? Those are my 2 takeaways. So,
yeah.
I think we've
that's
got
our
it.
solution.
That is genuinely really
Awesome.
interesting.
Chris, this was great. Really appreciate your take. Incredibly thoughtful and refreshing. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh man, I thought that was a really interesting chat with Chris. Pretty refreshing. What did you think?
I enjoyed it. I think we'd probably be mortal enemies if I was still in elected office and he was developing.
He's trying to get stuff built in your backyard.
It's super smart though, and like I think I like that his takeaway though that everyone thinks high rents are because of bad landlords, whereas actually there are a whole range of other factors. But you can argue bad policy, and there's a whole range of other factors which influence that. But it's intrigued me during my time in elected office, just the rise of the landlord as the baddie, right?
Yeah, it's so overly simplified, and there's just so much about.
There are awful landlords, of course, but there's the idea that they're all just on but it's this constant message young people and getting from both sides of politics now, like you're a victim, you're a victim, you're a victim. Like these people are are taking something from you. These people are unfairly treating you. Your employer's doing it. Your school did it. Your university isn't giving you what you're paying for. Your landlord is ripping you off. Big corporations ripping you off. If you wanted to end Western society, this would be the way to do it.
Yeah.
Despite
have people be more concerned about their feelings than about progress.
Yes, well, because I care about how people think, less about how they feel.
Yeah. Right? What are you drinking, by the way? I got Hoyne Brewing Por Favor Mexican style lager.
I'm very excited by this because Superflux are doing a mix pack at the moment of two experimentals. This is the experimental 67, which is their West Coast version of this, made with spruce tips. It's got Simcoe and Centennial. And I had the hazy version of this, also made with spruce tips. But this is the Westy version. But they're doing a mix pack. So you can buy 4-pack. Normally you have to buy all 4, but they do 2. You can buy 4-pack of 2
nice.
and 2. So I haven't had this one, but look at the colour of that.
Oh, yeah, lovely. Cheers.
Gorgeous. So I'm very excited by this, even though I'm not going to be able to drink it because I have to go and do work. So
wow.
What are you on then?
Yeah, so it's the Hoyne Por Favor Mexican style lager.
The Hoynes, you're always on the Hoynes.
Yeah, Hoyne just makes solid stuff.
Oh, it smells delicious.
Well, you've reminded me. I was in Quebec City last week visiting my grandfather, and he took me to a First Nations spice store, and I brought home with me a combination of ingredients that I'm hoping to brew with, throw into my beer, into a beer. Yeah. So the 2 I brought are Labrador tea and pine tips, actually. So I think it'd be possible to create a really interesting beer with those ingredients. Okay, good. Should we get into our issue scan for the week?
Yes, let's do that.
So let's start in Canada. Thing that caught my eye this week, PM Carney's courting oil industry in an attempt to Trump-proof Canada's economy. He's offered tentative backing for new pipelines, multi-billion-dollar projects to capture carbon from Alberta's oil sands. I think the quote was, we can give ourselves far more than any foreign government can ever take away. So we're in a position where we can build big, build bold, build one Canadian economy, and build now. Why I thought this particular story matters is that the strategic pivot underscores just how much I think has changed in such little time. Viewers that are familiar, listeners that are familiar with Mark Carney will know that he has warned of the climate risks associated with fossil fuel production when he was the governor of the Bank of England not that long ago. So it's an interesting change, but I think it speaks to. I feel like
is he going to build a pipeline? Is there really going to be a pipeline east or a pipeline west? Do we really believe that? And also,
proof will be in the pudding, right? It's easy to say these things, but the first step for someone like him is to put a marker in the sand, and he had to put a marker in the sand to say, well, the views that he holds as prime minister of this country in this crisis are different than the views he held as governor of the Bank of England. So I think it's a positive first step.
All of your principles for
What's that?
The job, isn't it? It's nice when you can just jettison one set of principles and acquire a whole new set of principles. Not a thing that's unique to liberals.
Sometimes you learn. Sometimes you learn.
Thing that people across the political spectrum are able to do with seeming ease. But anyway,
what do you think of the announcement?
Well, I suppose, as I've said, a question like, I'll believe it when I see it. because you look at some of the members of. So first of all, he folded in a load of NDP and some Green voters into this new voter coalition. Are they really going to stomach it? Are people like some of the MPs he's got, particularly out here in BC, who have, you know, a long history and heritage in very senior positions of, you know, making climate change their number one priority? I mean, if it's going to be, we're going to do pipelines and carbon capture and storage. Well, everyone's been talking about CCS for decades, and it's, you know, it's very expensive and it's a very complicated technology and all the rest of it. So I don't know. I mean, it's the right thing to say, but do I believe it's going to happen?
I assume by the tone of your voice, that's a hard no.
Well, I just, in 5 years' time, 4 years' time, whatever, do you think we'll be sitting here saying, "Oh, they really got spades in the ground on that new pipeline," or not? What's the chances? I would say the chances are we won't be sitting here saying that. We'll be sitting here saying, "Oh, everyone's still saying we've got to do this, but there's all these processes and all these consultations, and we've got to be careful of this." And just, you know, look, even the BC government here, when it, you know, announced all this infrastructure stuff, and then it gets blowback, then it's, you know, I don't know.
Then it pulls back.
What do you think? Do you think it's going to happen?
I think not nearly at the pace that everyone's talking that it will, but my hope is, I think it's possible that at a quicker pace than what we've become accustomed to over the last 10 years.
Okay, well, we'll see.
So we'll see.
I mean, I hope so. And, you know, look, I give him credit, right? Because we're both conservatives, but he looks the part, sounds the part.
Yeah.
And, you know, the speech from the throne he set out, I don't know whether you know, but I was there.
Were you there?
Yeah, I was at the speech from the throne. You know, like when I was at the coronation. And when
you were at the coronation as well.
I like to talk about these things, but, you know, one was je was there. But you know, I was listening to that. I thought, I agree with most of this, right? I agree with most of this. So, you know.
Yeah. But the proof is going to be in the pudding. Okay, let's move on to the UK. There's.
So yes, talking of people jettisoning all of their previous statements. Sorry, yes, I interrupted you. Carry on.
Well, no, it sounds like you have a story that you want to cover. It's different than mine, I think.
Okay.
So
well, mine was the Strategic Defence Review, which is the. So bearing in mind that Keir Starmer, Sir Keir, who sat alongside, you know, avowed unilateral disarmament, anti-nuclear guy, Jeremy Corbyn, when he was leader of the Labour Party, sat in his shadow cabinet, tried to make him Prime Minister. Now he is actually, Keir Starmer himself is Prime Minister. Strategic Defence Review, you know, massive investment in defence, the government talking about we need to be on a war footing, talking about a second form of deployment of the UK's nuclear arsenal, so possibly, because it's all obviously submarines at the moment, through the F-35 fighter programme potentially. I think 12 or 15 attack subs are going to be constructed, increasing number of personnel in the military, and a whole series of other, you know, new technology investments. So this is, you know, I agree with it all, because this is absolutely what the West has to get its head around, right? Which is, you know, wars are never far away, right? We think that, well, we've had one and that's the end of it. Increasingly destabilized world, but, you know, interesting that these folks were all, you know, from the left and aligned with a leader who was, I'm happy to serve a leader who would balk at all of this, and now it's Labour policy.
Yeah, but I guess they're learning.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's also like, I mean, look, we all just have to do this. The whole, you know, of the West just needs to recognise that this is, you know, we can't, because it's. I think the statement was as well that, you know, we have to fight wars by necessity, and therefore we may be in a position where we have to fight a war by necessity, and we need to be. We can't wait for that war to start to be in a position to be able to win it. So there's a whole load of stuff on munitions and everything else. So anyway, what was your?
And it's the right call. It's the right call because of the proximity the UK has to Russia,
exactly,
which is a massive aggressor.
Like Sarah Palin, we can almost see it from our house.
Almost.
Very big binoculars. So anyway,
the story that I have for the UK actually connects to the US, so we'll combine the two of them, which is OECD coming out today. We're recording this on Tuesday, June 3rd, downgrading UK growth forecast amid US tariffs and projecting US economic slowdown due to tariffs. The numbers, economic growth in the U.S., the OECD is now projecting a forecast of 1.6% growth in 2025, down from an earlier projection of 2.8%. And the reason, of course, is being attributed to the aggressive tariff policies. The way it's been positioned is by the OECD is that the tariffs have had massive repercussions for everyone, and as a result, trimmed growth forecasts for China, for France, for India, for Japan, for South Africa, and the UK. And this is a further downgrade to the OECD's already downbeat March interim forecast. So, I mean, you and I don't think are going to disagree necessarily on this. It's just, I think it's just, this is what happens when you introduce protectionist trade measures in a hyper-globalized economy, right?
In the way that they've been doing, I mean, that's interesting, 1.6%, we're down to the levels of growth that Europe has considered to be quite good for the last few years, right? And it's always, it's been, the US has been the standout of Western nations, right, in terms of its growth figures generally. And these are figures that, that bring the US down to what Europeans have considered to be relatively sluggish figures and not good.
Right.
And everyone has, spent a lot of time analyzing this over the last few years and arguing for why we're unable to hit some of the American levels. So, well done for bringing your growth rates down to. I think it's also just the way they've been done, right? The other story that's breaking is, the UK had done this trade deal with the US, but then apparently the US is going to apply the 50% steel tariffs to the UK. We think that's where it's heading. So it's just this, you can't, it's like he seems to be 1 minute rowing away from it, then it's all back on again. Then it's like, oh yeah, we think there's a deal to be done. And that in and of itself just makes it impossible to plan in the economy. So that will be having an impact as well. So.
Yeah, Scott Galloway on his podcast has been saying a lot, where we're going to end up, whether it's over the next year, over the next 3, or the next 4, is a lot of this stuff's going to get rolled back. But the pain of going through the on and off, back and forth, we got a deal, we don't have a deal, we're going to re-sign the deal, is just going to cause so much long-term damage. Even if we end up back to where we were pre-Trump, the recovery is not going to be quite so clear. And that's what happens when you treat so many of your allies the way that
as we
Trump
said at
has.
The beginning of all this, as with many things with Donald Trump, he has a point. So, China's decision to deliberately undercut and, in the case of steel, dump steel and all the rest of it to destroy Western manufacturing needs to be addressed. But applying 50% tariffs to Canadian steel and aluminium and British steel is not the way to address that. So, anyway.
Well, there we are. You got to go do some TV hit because I guess you were once an MP or something.
I'm about to do because obviously,
Oh, radio.
So,
Well,
about this very issue as it happens. So.
Oh yeah. Nice. Well, then let's close out with our tasting notes.
This is fantastic. You would love this. But everything you'd expect, really piney, bit like drinking a Christmas tree, just clean, crisp. Kind of, I get. There's a bit of like berry aftertaste as well, but it's in the front. It's very, very piney, very clean. And at the back, I'm getting like something more like a berry kind of stern fruit type.
Oh, nice.
So I don't know where that's coming from. You'll be able to tell me on the hop. Really nice on the nose as well.
Good. Well, this Hoyne Por Favor Mexican style lager is as advertised. It is absolutely crisp and clean. Touch of corn. I have not thrown lime into it, but it'd be perfect if I threw in a wedge of lime on a hot summer's day. And it is beautifully sunny here in Vancouver today. It felt like summer, so it's the perfect. I'd say it's the perfect beer for your barbecue circuit if you can find it on your store shelf.
It's a shame it's 2 p.m. on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
The picture you paint was a beautiful one.
So. Yeah. Okay, guys, that's our show for the week. Don't forget to subscribe to the show so we can pop into your feeds. Have a good one.
Speak soon.